The War for Independence by Pat McCarthy. When the American Revolution began, the colonists were not fighting for freedom from Britain. The colonists were upset about taxes made by Parliament, Britain's lawmaking body. They did not think the taxes were fair because they could not vote for members of Parliament. Parliament passed the Stamp Act in 1765, which said the colonists had to buy stamps to put on important papers, such as letters, deeds, newspapers, and playing cards. Many colonists refused to buy the stamps. Parliament thought the taxes were fair. The French and Indian War had cost a lot of money. British soldiers had protected the colonists, so Parliament thought the colonists should help pay for the war. Parliament also passed more acts that taxed the colonists. The Boston Tea Party. Parliament finally took away all the taxes but the one on tea. But the colonists were still not happy. 3 ships full of tea were sent to Boston Harbor, but the people of Boston would not let them unload the tea. Britain refused to take the tea back. A group of patriots dressed as Mohawks climbed onto the ships. They threw the tea overboard. This was known as the Boston Tea Party. No one knows who the men were, but some were probably members of a group of patriot activists called the Sons of Liberty. Britain closed the port of Boston. The Battles of Lexington and Concord. On the night of April 18, 1775, 800 British soldiers marched from Boston to the town of Lexington. When they reached Lexington, there were about 50 soldiers waiting. They called themselves Minutemen, because they were ready to fight at a minute's notice. The British were on their way to Concord, where the colonists stored their weapons. The night before, 3 horseback riders had tried to warn people that the British were coming. In Lexington, a British officer yelled, "Disperse, ye rebels, disperse!" A shot rang out. Nobody knows who fired first, but the British did not wait for orders. They began shooting. 8 Minutemen were killed and 10 others were wounded. The British troops marched on to Concord and took the weapons in the storehouse. They searched houses and farms but did not find the rest of the weapons because they had been taken to other towns. The British then returned to Boston. When the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia heard of the battles, it chose George Washington to be in charge of the new army. The Battle of Bunker Hill. The next major battle was the Battle of Bunker Hill. It was fought on nearby Breed's Hill. British ships were in Boston Harbor, and the Americans heard the British were going to attack. The Americans took guns to the top of Breed's Hill during the night of June 16, 1775. They built a redoubt there. A redoubt is a fort made by piling up mounds of dirt. When the British woke up the next morning, they were shocked to see the redoubt. They began firing from the ships, but the fort was out of range. 2,000 British soldiers started up the hill. The Americans did not shoot until the British were close. Colonel William Prescott told his men, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." Finally, shots rang out, and dozens of British soldiers fell. Twice the British were forced to retreat, but the third time they were able to take the hill. Dr. Joseph Warren was the first American officer to die in the war. He was a loyal patriot and leader. Warren was an officer but chose to fight with his troops. The British won the Battle of Bunker Hill, but the Americans proved they could fight well. More than 1,000 British were killed or wounded. The Americans lost about 145 men. During the next year and a half, several battles were fought. The Americans created a navy. France began helping the colonies. The Continental Congress wrote and signed the Declaration of Independence, which said the 13 colonies were a free country. The Battle of Trenton. On December 25, 1776, the British Army was camped in Trenton, New Jersey. Most of the men were German soldiers paid to fight for the British. Washington knew they would celebrate Christmas late into the night with dancing and singing. He decided to surprise them with an attack the next morning. During the night, 2,400 American soldiers crossed the river. The British Army was taken completely by surprise. None of Washington's soldiers were killed, and only 4 of them were wounded. One of Washington's officers wrote in his diary, "We have taken nearly 1,000 prisoners, 6 cannon, more than 1,000 muskets, 12 drums." The Battle of Trenton gave the Americans supplies and weapons they needed badly. It also helped their morale. A few days later, the Americans beat the British at Princeton. In July 1777, the British took Fort Ticonderoga in New York. Marquis de Lafayette, a Frenchman, came to help and became Washington's trusted aide. The Battle of Saratoga. British General John Burgoyne planned to send 3 armies into New York State. The armies would meet in Albany and cut New England off from the rest of the colonies. The Americans held the British off during the First Battle of Saratoga on September 19, 1777. General Burgoyne was forced to retreat. 3 weeks later, the Americans beat the British at Bemis Heights in the Second Battle of Saratoga. This was a major American victory. Major General Horatio Gates and Major General Benedict Arnold led the American army. The 2 sides negotiated, and on October 17, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army of 5,000 men. The Battle of Saratoga was the turning point of the war, and things began to change. The world now believed the Americans could win the war. European countries gave their support. In the winter of 1777, Washington's army stayed at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. The soldiers were cold, hungry, and often sick. They did not have enough supplies. In July, France declared war on Britain. Now the British had to worry about fighting 2 wars. In 1779, the British asked American Indians to attack frontier settlements. That September, the American Navy, led by John Paul Jones, fought a battle with a British ship. The British asked him to surrender, but Jones answered, "I have not yet begun to fight." The next spring, the British captured Fort Moultrie in Charleston, South Carolina. This was the worst American defeat in the war. The Americans lost their entire Southern army. British troops, led by General Charles Cornwallis, defeated the Americans in battles in South Carolina. Cornwallis then planned to invade North Carolina. He changed his plans after the Americans won the Battle of Kings Mountain. General Nathanael Greene and his army chased Cornwallis throughout the backwoods of Virginia and the Carolinas. Cornwallis then planned to invade North Carolina. He changed his plans after the Americans won the Battle of Kings Mountain. The Battle of Yorktown. In a brilliant move, Washington planned to attack the British on the Yorktown Peninsula. French Admiral de Grasse brought ships and troops to Chesapeake Bay to help. De Grasse's ships fought a major battle with the British ships. The British lost and retreated to New York. De Grasse kept Cornwallis from leaving the peninsula by sea. De Grasse sent some ships up Chesapeake Bay to bring the rest of Washington's army to Yorktown. The American soldiers then started a siege of Yorktown. They surrounded the British, keeping them from retreating by land. British supplies ran low, and the French ships shot cannons at the British day and night. Finally, on October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. This was the last major battle of the war. Britain's Parliament voted in February to stop fighting the war. The untrained and poorly outfitted group of American patriots had beaten the well-trained and well-supplied British Army and Navy. The United States of America was free at last.